Welcome back to Business Beat Live Special Edition as we continue our spirited discussion here with Rocky Castleberry, who's just in from Georgetown, Texas, and the author of the recently released book, Creating Wealth for the Average Guy, and also added at the end, and gals. Rocky, let's talk about I noticed in Chapter 4 you talk about the money trap, traps that can keep you from becoming wealthy and keeping your wealth. I think there's sounds like that's a great chapter, probably has some do's and don'ts and some great advice for one to follow.
Exactly, and this is all part of just starting the mindset. I talked about in Chapter 1, you need to start your mindset looking away from your past and looking to the future and creating your vision where you want to go. You know, you've heard of MC Hammer, I'm sure.
That I have.
Yeah, MC Hammer, back in the early 90s, came out with that hit, You Can't Touch This. And overnight, he was a pop phenomenon. I mean, just millions of dollars pouring in. I mean, even had the MC Hammer pants and everything. I'm assuming that you probably had a pair of MC Hammer pants, John.
I think you might have assumed it incorrectly, but I found a few other things over the years that, well, just that might date me a little bit more. But
yeah, but just for the record, I never had the MC Hammer pants either.
For the record, I haven't either.
But anyway, MC Hammer all of a sudden had all this money, okay? Now, he did not grow up with millions of dollars, and so therefore he had not learned to handle a bunch of money. And that is one of the money traps, is as you create wealth, you learn how to maintain your wealth. And if you all of a sudden come into a lot of money, you need to change your mindset and think about what you're going to do with your newfound money instead of just going out and spend it. MC got millions of dollars. The first thing he did is he started a $500,000 per month payroll. He bought large houses, he bought fancy cars, he made bad investments, and this is a guy that had a hit record, had endorsements by KFC, Pepsi, did world tours, and just a few short years later, he was $30 million in debt and bankrupt. And I don't know if you knew this, but 90% of all lottery winners are bankrupt within 5 years. And that comes.
Well, you read about that as far as lottery winners concerned many times in the papers. There was one, I think it was down in Kentucky, that was in the paper the last 6 months or so, that had won $1 gazillion not too many years ago and was on poverty row.
Oh yeah, and it just comes from not being able to properly handle your money. Okay, where does it go? First, there's a difference between good debt and bad debt. Okay, bad debt is things that take away from your monthly cash flow. You know, the big new boat, the big new car, the fancy house. All these things are not good investments. I mean, would you invest in a stock that you knew would be 10%, have the 10% of its value in just 5 years?
Probably not.
Probably not.
Particularly if I was a prudent investor, I wouldn't.
Exactly, but you know, when you buy a brand new car, that's what happens. Now, that doesn't mean you go without a car, but did you know 80% of all millionaires drive secondhand cars? And the reason is...
Before you get into the reason, how about the best example of all? Sam Walton and his famous truck. I can still see the picture, the image of the truck, the 1937, whatever it was, or some such thing. I mean, the guy drove around, with an old truck and like a farmer's outfit on, and yet he had more money than all banks in Arkansas.
Oh, exactly right. And of course, what they do is they let somebody else take the big hit up front on the quick depreciation, but they still drive a new car. I mean, a nice car, fairly new car. I lost my train of thought for a second. That's bad debt. Good debt is things that create monthly cash flow for you. A rent house, and what I like to think of with a rent house is we all have money, okay? And what I like to do is I like to think as my money as a little green employee that goes to work for me every day. And
that's a great way to characterize it, basically. Yeah. The money is green, basically. It's basically an employee, and if it's working for you, in essence, it is an employee.
Exactly, and what's cool about it is very prolific. Money has little baby monies. And if you let the little monies grow up, then they have more babies. And meanwhile, it just snowballs and becomes larger and larger.
That kind of reminds me basically of the situation of myself, basically, Rocky, although I haven't been terribly successful at it over the years, but sometimes people wonder why when I'm walking around, particularly when I'm in Europe, I'm looking down. Well, they talk about pennies from heaven, but I've yet to see any come down, but I do find money on the street. I think I'll leave right now and see if I can find, no, maybe I better wait a while, but won't find enough to make it worthwhile.
You know what's funny about that is I have this friend of mine, and he has these very wealthy clients, and he said those guys walk up and down the street, and they always have their head down, and they'll pick up every quarter and every penny they find. I mean, these guys are worth millions. And he says I have fun with them. What I'll do before I go in their office, I'll take my loose change and I'll throw it on the sidewalk before I go in there, just to watch them pick up the quarters and the dimes and the nickels.
Because they might catch on after a while, but great thing to do to actually see it firsthand.
Yeah, but what's funny is you're thinking, well, these guys are millionaires. What do they need with a nickel, a dime, and a quarter? Well, it's the little things that get you. It is absolutely the little things that get you. Give you a perfect example. I had this employee that works for me, okay? And every morning he would come in with a McDonald's hamburger and hot coffee, and he'd buy a $5 breakfast. And one morning, he was just wailing and moaning because he did not have enough money to go on a cruise. And I looked at him and I started smiling. He says, "What are you smiling at?" I said, "Well, did you buy that breakfast this morning?" He goes, "Yes." I said, "How much you pay for it?" He said, "About $5. I said, "Did you realize if you bought your sodas at the grocery store and you made this little breakfast that's similar and probably tastes better than McDonald's, you could save $5 a day, and in 6 months you would have enough money to go on your cruise?" He never thought about it.
Yeah, but you see, here's an interesting point, Rocky. Let's talk about this for a moment. You talk about, and I couldn't agree more, obviously you agree with it, but you talk about changing one's mindset. Isn't that easier said than done?
Not necessarily. You just have to start.
I tend to think it is. That's why I'm kind of challenging you with a question, because somebody, for example, let's say somebody's been in business, maybe they've owned some rental real estate or whatever. The business hasn't gone well. The rental real estate, there's been a lot of vacancies. Maybe there's been some other problems where they've had to call the police, that sort of thing. They've had to, this is kind of like a worst case scenario, but they've also had to evict a couple of tenants or whatever. They're down and out. I want to get rid of this stuff. I want to move out of this area or whatever. And all of a sudden, Rocky Castleberry comes along and says, "Change your mindset, Mr. Smith, and you're going to make $1 million." But it seems as though it's a challenge that takes a tremendous amount of fortitude, a tremendous amount of something on the person's, I don't know, their character, their ability, whatever, to get into that new mindset that you're referring to.
Well, let me quantify it with this. It's very easy to change your mindset, but it's hard to have the self-discipline to follow that mindset. Do you follow me?
That's okay. Well said, very well spoken.
Self-discipline, that's the key. Let me give you another example. I have a guy that works for me. I'm going to just call him Bob for right now. Okay, Bob started work for me, and when he started working for me, he was getting paid the lowest scale pay in my company. He was working in the field, doing the lowest job in the company. Within 4 years, he had become a very qualified technician. He was a very hard worker, and he was making 4 to 5 times what he started at. Came in my office one day and says, "Rocky, I got a problem." I said, "What?" He goes, "I just can't I can't live on what you're paying me." And I said, "Well, Bob, what did you start at?" He said, "Well, I started at this." And I said, "Well, Bob, you're making 5 times that right now. Why can't you live on what you're making now?" And that is the problem that plagues 98% of us. And a lot of it comes from the easy credit, easy financing.
I was just going to interject this as well, basically, Rocky. It's funny you talk about easy credit, because one of the things that I've done for a living for a gazillion years, tax accountant, tax preparation. One of the interesting things that you see, and you would love to have a business where you counsel people like this. Let's say it's sort of a broad brush situation. Young couples, basically with or without kids, let's say maybe early to mid-20s to, let's say, late 40s or whatever. You do their income tax return, and forgetting maybe other investments or whatever, but let's just say W-2 forms, example, make it simple. Maybe a $90,000, $100,000, $150,000 income between the two of them. And then you get to what's called Schedule B, interest income. And then you see 1 or 2 1099 forms, and from the 2 local banks, or the 1 local bank or whatever, they've got $79.11 in interest. What does that tell you? They're living on those 2 words you just mentioned, easy credit.
That's right. And
everything, the house, the car, the big TV, the Sears credit card, this credit card, that credit card, and hardly any cash.
Exactly. And what I always tell everybody, and it's in my book, invest in yourself first. Invest in your self-discipline. Invest in getting rid of a lot of this debt. For example, my credit card has a 16% interest rate on it. If I run up money on that, I don't know of any, well, I know there's investments out there, but there's few investments out there that will make 16% or higher. Well, if you start paying down this debt, you are actually making 16% on your money because you're getting rid of that 16% interest.
Now, let me pose this question to you. You talk about invest in yourself first. Great theory, great principle. More than one person other than yourself has said it over the years. Print, TV, radio, in their book or whatever. But how about in the real world? I can think of a client I had a number of years ago that if he followed that invest in yourself first principle, he would have been out of business sooner rather than later. Meaning that he had employees and he had all his other overhead, utilities, rent, the normal type things that businesses have, insurance, what have you. He could just barely pay those. But if you don't pay your utility bills and your overhead, they may shut off the power or what have you. You could be out of business. If you don't pay your taxes, you can be out of business. If you don't pay your employees and you don't have, you can't produce what you're producing, you can be out of business. So what happens if the theory says pay yourself first, but in practice the money is not there?
Okay.
At a point in time.
Chapter 5, cash flow is king. And there's a reason they say cash flow is king. And let me give you a perfect example. In my company, I did this 6 months ago. I bought a piece of equipment that cost me $750 per month. Okay?
Lease purchase?
Lease purchase, exactly what it was. Now, what that did is that saved me enough billable time that we could actually recapture $2,750 of billable time and start billing that out. Okay? By doing that, I made an extra $2,000 per month. Now, going back to what you said, okay, here's a guy that's financed to the max. He has a lot of trouble paying his bills already. Now, I'm not saying what you need to do is start paying off all your debt immediately and then let everything go by the wayside. Don't let your bills get paid off. But what you need to do is you need to quit spending and quit financing first of all, and then start paying down debt as you can. Now, let's say you have a $200 bill and you have a $100 monthly bill. Well, if you can pay the $100 monthly bill off, then that's fine. Get that paid off. And then once you have that extra $100, instead of spending it, go over and start paying on the $200 bill. Reduce that equity. And if you start doing that, before long, you have a whole lot of extra cash. Don't go spend it. Put your little green employees to work for you. And did you know that a part of all you keep, a part of all that you make is yours to keep? And most people say, well, that doesn't make any sense. Everything I make, I get to keep. Well, that's not true. See, you've already decided who your employees are going to work for. Are they going to work for the finance company on the big screen TV? Are they going to work for your credit card company? You need to change your mindset. Look, okay, what can I do to increase cash flow that I can turn around and invest?
Well, I think one of the conclusions that one could draw when you talk about a lot of this different theory, not just you, Rocky, but it could be myself, it could be other financial people, whatever the case is that, and I find this for all the years I've been in the business field, some of the businesses, or most of the businesses that have the most problems are the smaller businesses, where the mindset many times is, and maybe you've seen this as well, is I can't afford. Or meaning, well, I couldn't afford an attorney when I started up the business, so I went off as self-employed when it should have been maybe an LLC or corporation. Well, I couldn't afford an accountant because, well, God, they get so much an hour or whatever. And I couldn't afford to do something else and what have you. But why is it always costs more later on to correct the problem? That sort of thing. And again, the mindset is I can't afford, when in reality, had they been able to afford or plan their affairs a little bit differently, they would not be into the problems that they wind up just a few years in business.
That's exactly right. And you have to change your mindset, look to the future. Perfect example, I have an attorney, very expensive. Okay, he's a lot more expensive than the guy down the street. But I cannot wait to go see that guy. Do you know why? Because every time I see that guy, I make money. When I first met him, my first project, he cost me $8,000 for the consultation and set up the business. But you realize he saves me over $12,000 a year in taxes. So because I spent $8,000, I invested in him. Now I make $12,000 a year.
But you saw kind of like the cost-benefit ratio or whatever you want to call it.
Exactly.
You saw that basically if I invest this much, I'll get back more than that in some other way. Somebody else, of course, might look at it along the lines